Hi, Paul here. It's a story today. It's a story of how I got into sampling in the first place. And this has kind of been a constant all the way through from the very beginning of when I started writing music. Back in 1993, I just finished my degree, which was in aeronautical engineering, and I really desperately wanted to get into music. I wanted to do a music course to learn more about film and TV music. And the only place that I could get a look in was Bournemouth University. Professor Stephen Deutsch, who I think liked the idea that I didn't have a music degree and I'd be the one student who didn't, and saw something in me. And so he gave me a place on this course, and we had 8 workstations in this room, and in each person's workstation we had a really basic setup. We had an Apple Mac running Studio Vision Pro, we had a Proteus 2, a very basic orchestral synth at EMU, we had a Corgo 1W, which was our keyboard, and then we had this sampler. And it's not an ancient classic, it was an Akai SO1. As you can see, not revered, but it had a little bit of recording time, and we could use it to record sounds and then incorporate those sounds into our music. And I loved it, and I started recording all kinds of stuff into it, and experimenting with how I could kind of combine that with the other sounds to create something that sounded interesting. It's been, the whole thing for me has always been about trying to make your music sound different from everybody else. So something that's unique only to you. So after college, I did various jobs, demonstrating pianos in Harrods, cleaning out vegetable cabinets in Sainsbury's. And then eventually I got into a little music production company in Soho, where I spent the next 4 or 5 years writing loads and loads of music for commercials, below the line stuff, theme tunes, car shows, all kinds of things. And we had better samplers there. So we had the S1100s and we had S3000s, and they were kind of the source for almost all of the sounds that we were using. I was writing music on a MPC 60 initially, even orchestral music, which was interesting. And I would use the samplers for all kinds of stuff. So I did quite a lot of dance remixes, so I was using them to kind of fly vocals in and change parts and all that kind of stuff. But also I was using them creatively. And for example, I did a pitch for a money show on ITV and sampled a load of kind of coin noises, picked the ones that seemed to work best, incorporated them in the music. And that sounds like this. Forgive the slightly dodgy demo. And then in '99, I was lucky to get a place on the ASCAP film scoring workshop. So while I was in LA, I went to West LA Music and bought an EMU E4, and really loved using that. Sounded different from the Akai's and gave an extra kind of level of control to the way that I was using samplers then. And then of course the XS24 came out in 2000, so we were introduced to the idea of using the sampler within Logic, within the DAW environment. And also Giga Studio was released, the follow-up to Giga Sampler. So there were lots of things happening in sampling around that time, and the idea of kind of streaming stuff from discs. Suddenly you could have incredibly long sounds without needing to have loads and loads of memory. That was a massive revolution as well. So between 2001 and 2008, I was doing lots of TV shows, I was making records, I was doing tons of sampling, using samples in all of my work. For example, I did a show for Discovery called Discovery Project Earth, or Ways to Save the Planet, it was called in some territories, which was a show about geoengineering, and really interesting. And I decided I would use lots of kind of crafting sounds, DIY crafting sort of stuff. So I did lots of tape ripping, lots of scissors, anything that you could kind of think of as being making something from bits and bobs of whatever, because that's what they were doing on the show, and use those as part of the rhythm track of the music. I did a show called The Genius of Charles Darwin, in which I used a lot of kind of wine glasses and glass sounds in place of, things that you might use traditionally, Celeste or marimba, that kind of stuff. Sounds like this. And then in 2006, I tried to get a private sample library off the ground on a web forum. This was the post. that discussion kind of went nowhere. And then by coincidence, I'd been introduced to Christian, and we decided to co-fund just an experiment one evening, and spent some money getting some downtime in air and getting 6 violins in. And that was the start of what became Spitfire. So between 2008 and 2010, I recorded and programmed an entire orchestra with chamber strings and symphonic strings. At that time, we didn't have any legato stuff in there. We hadn't yet started really looking into that, because it was more about getting the sound right initially. It was about, I could never understand why people weren't recording orchestral samples the way that you record music and scores. It seemed crazy to me that people would be recording these sounds with a microphone right up against the instrument, and in this kind of anechoic environment and all that kind of stuff, trying to exclude as much of the space and the kind of humanity in the sound as possible. And I wanted to go completely the other way. So that was the theory initially. It was literally to set up as if it's a film session. And I often refer to it as the most expensive orchestration course anybody's ever taken, because I'd spent weeks and weeks and weeks listening in the studio to individual players and sections playing things, experimenting with stuff. The very first session that we did, I had an idea that I could kind of create more uncertainty around the starts of the notes by plotting a really unusual course through the notes and having the players play to a backing track. So that was back in 2007 or 2008. I can't remember when the very first session was. And it was really successful for that kind of time. But it was too, at that stage, I guess it worked for a small group of people who were happy to work around any kind of limitations. But for producing commercial samples, we had to find other ways of doing it. But it's interesting. This is the backing track. So you get the idea. It's really basic. The beats are very, very soft. I think I even low pass filtered them as well. But they were just there to kind of keep the groove going. But we had to be really careful that they didn't come out through the headphones, because obviously that multiplies with the number of players. But the idea was to just have something that kind of felt like music. And it really worked at that stage, especially when the players were unfamiliar with this level of kind of sampling of this. It wasn't that common back then, and it's become more common. And we always joke about the fact that the harmonics that we recorded for the bespoke library are just so kind of fragile and broken sounding. And then everyone's using loads of harmonics in film and TV music in the years since then. And then the players get better and better and better because they're playing harmonics all the time. So now the harmonics are almost, perfect. There's almost no kind of imperfections in them at all. So that's kind of funny. One of the things was I started in Giga Studio. Giga Studio had a program called GVI4, which was going to be their new sample playback engine. And you could make it into a plugin and all of that kind of stuff. So I had the development environment. I spent 6 months programming the first sample library, which was chamber strings, into that. And then just as I started sending it out to our group, Tascam announced that they were ceasing any development on Giga Studio. So I had to start again and had to learn how to program it in Contact, which was actually fine. I mean, none of this stuff is actually that hard. It's just a case of sitting down and working it out. So we went through the whole orchestra. We recorded percussion. That turned out to be a bit of a nightmare because our kind of little group of A-list film composers, nobody seemed to want the percussion because everyone's like, yeah, I record my own percussion. So all of a sudden we were forced into a corner of, oh dear, we spent a lot of money on this and we're not going to make the money back. Because this was not a money-making venture at the beginning. It was just about getting better sounds and just paying the costs of making them. So Joby, the percussionist, agreed with us to try out a commercial release, and I learned how to script a basic front end in Contact and some graphics and all that kind of stuff. Put the controls on the front. I thought it's a really interesting way of having all of the mics available and being able to blend between the mics. And I don't think that had really been done. It certainly wasn't very widely done at that stage. I think most orchestral libraries, if they had mic signals, they were all in separate patches in Contact. A lot of people ask me, what did the bespoke orchestra sound like? And I've showed little clips of it on videos before. But the easiest way for me to demonstrate it is just to play a bit from Little Big Planet 2, because I used it pretty much exclusively on that. And it sounds like this. Very basic functionality, nothing like the level of functionality we have in our sample libraries that we make now, but it sounded great. It was a big step forward at that point because we recorded it right. The idea of recording it, in a room with the mics all set up and all that kind of stuff. And I was trying out new ideas like recording to a backing track, as I mentioned, but also trying out these kind of different ways of getting more musicality into things. And that was when the impulse notes, which obviously became eventually the thing that we developed further kind of research into and used in Appassionata, and then with the team doing more R&D, refining the techniques, coming up with new ideas, that's gone into the Abbey Road Orchestra strings as well. One of the other things was effects, orchestral effects, which always seemed to me to be one shots. They were like a sound that you recognize from everything. You'd hear it on a commercial, you'd see it on in a film, you'd know immediately, oh yeah, that's that sound from that library. And I wanted to grab a bunch of stuff at the end of every session, and this is something which I'm going to go on to, but I wanted to grab a bunch of stuff that I could then make into playable orchestral effects. So you could ride the mod wheel through them. They were at different pitch centers and all that kind of stuff. And that was literally a bunch of stuff that I captured, tried to think of what effects I'd use writing, and things like a kind of the chattering sound, the slides and all that kind of thing. And then got all that stuff recorded as quickly as possible, but recorded it in such a way that it could be really playable. So I kind of graduated from using the last 10 minutes of a session to grab a load of stuff like the effects and things like that. I started thinking about this when I was doing TV scoring, and there's often this kind of mismatch between the recording dates. You might only have one day of recording because that's all the budget allows. But you have to do it kind of round about episode 2 of let's say a 6 or 8 part show, because you've got to deliver episode 1 before you've started work on episode 4, let's say. So how do you do that then? Well, the way that I found of doing this was to get a bunch of cues and ideas and stuff signed off by the director and producer, and then you can break stuff out of that and make building blocks to write the rest of the score with. So you use that stuff as much as you can, and it brings an amazing amount of production value to the rest of the music. So I can give you a couple of examples. So this is a show that I did called The Interceptor for BBC. And I had the kind of harmonic language of the show worked out, and I knew what chords I was going to be using in certain cues. And so I got my horn section to record those chords as standalone things. So I had a bunch of those that I could then use in the writing as well. But I mean, if you can see that I've got break beats that I recorded. These were all during the actual sessions, the one day of sessions that I had. Swells, I've got string chords. So for example, just to show you those. Falls. All that kind of stuff is incredibly useful. I had a whole tone to half tone, mod wheel controlled, which was really nice and gave me lots of flexibility there, because again, it's something that you can, if you've got some control over the patch, you can shape it to the music that you're writing, and it doesn't feel like just some effect that you've plopped on. Now, the other thing that I did was I wrote a bunch of melodies and got them played by the cellos and also by the violins, so that I would have these things that I could drop into the kind of tension moments where music is pulsing along, but you don't, you want to have something that sounds like a nice fragment of melody. And there are lots of different ones. They're obviously all in the same kind of key center, but that works for scoring. And you can see, so there's a bunch of stuff there that I used for that. So that was the interceptor. I did a show called The Fades, where I was using some stuff. I recorded the brass separately so that I could get control over this, but then was able to reuse some of that brass in later episodes. And it's worth saying, this is a thing that you can book in with the Musicians Union. You can pay a little bit extra to use your session multi-episodically, but obviously you can't use this stuff in any other show. But and you can hear exactly, you only have to play a few things. If you're writing this carefully and you're working on this stuff with a view to being able to reuse things as well, you can just get so much mileage out of this and bring the whole tone of the show way up. Now, the other thing that I recorded, and actually some of this stuff that I've done myself, there are a few things that I did for the Fades, which I've then used subsequently in my sample library Journeys, which goes with my album. If you're interested, check out the links below. So as you can hear, that's stuff that I've just recorded in my own environment, but also I've made a pad out of this. So, and if you look in, I mean, it's super simple. That's what I'm saying. This stuff doesn't have to be complicated to be good. And of course, there's a bunch of effects. Blake kindly created this UI for me, so you can, really go to town on that stuff. I used all kinds of slowed down sounds, like striking matches and things like that. When you record that kind of stuff and you kind of just mess around with it, you can get some really great effects that you can use in your music. So there's a bunch of stuff like that. I think I did some of my own cello sounds where I recorded. Yeah, all kinds of cool stuff. There's a drone that I did. Anyway, you get the idea. So the two things are the private sampling, the private bespoke stuff that you do yourself to create something that you can then use in the score, but also recording extra stuff in the sessions from the musicians so that you can use that stuff repeating across the whole project, maybe even when you don't have multiple dates for recording new material. You can still get that high production value across the whole series. So what's the point of this? It's to make you sound different. And that's been my whole MO all the way through from the 90s when I was doing this at the beginning and recording, sounds to use in my music back then. It was basically, how can I make my music sound different from everyone else's? And the easiest way to do that, to get that production sounding different, is to create some of your own sounds and use them in the production in creative ways. The other thing is, making something like that makes you write different stuff because there's just you just start playing things and it gives you new ideas. Because maybe, you just got one, we call it Akai style sampling, or I do call it Akai style sampling. It's basically like one sample spread across the whole keyboard, has a certain magic to it. It's just really good fun. So that's my life in sampling. That's kind of, that period of despite it being kind of almost nervous breakdown inducing at moments, of kind of single-handedly editing and producing an entire orchestral sample library without really knowing what I was doing initially, taught me an enormous amount about, that I took into my own sampling projects of TV and film later on, but obviously, of course, into the kind of design of all the stuff that we did at Spitfire. And, it's just kind of rolling your sleeves up and getting your hands dirty and starting off with that stuff will lead you down really interesting and unknown paths into the future, and help to make your music sound, more characterful and more unique, I guess. So I hope that was interesting. That's my life in sampling. That's the kind of weird path that I've taken, and how, in a funny kind of way, recording stuff myself to play on keyboards has always been a part of my compositional process and journey. For whatever reason, maybe it's my strange brain, my combination of kind of sciencey, engineering-y sort of side alongside the artistic and musical side. It's that combination that leads me to want to find more complicated solutions to any given problem. Anyway, thanks very much for watching. Look forward to seeing you on the next one. Bye bye.